the same Saul who becomes Paul, the same Paul who has written these letters to the early church that make up a large portion of our New Testament, letters that we've written for our own edification. A reminder that that's the same person who was one of the early persecutors of the church. The disciples have been told that he's had a conversion experience. That's the other story that you know. Saul, on the road to Damascus, encounters the risen Christ, and his life is changed. So you see behind you, first, a rendering of the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr of the church, and Saul standing there collecting coats and encouraging everyone. And then you see on the other, on that side, you see on the other side part of the image of Saul being knocked from his horse as he's traveling to Damascus and looking up into the heavens and saying, "Who is this?" And the voice coming down, "Why do you persecute me?" The threat that is Saul is real to the church, and then this happens, the story. Saul decides to go down to Jerusalem. He's heading down to church headquarters, and he's saying, "Hey, it's me. I'm a Christian now." They want to use that word. I'm on the way. I'm a member of the way. I've experienced Jesus Christ. I want to join. Can I be a member? And the disciples, who are part of the council of the new church, they're looking at each other and they're thinking, "You got to be kidding me. What do we make of this?" When Saul had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all, can't blame them, afraid of him. You remember the saying, fifth column, that Ernest Hemingway story about someone who infiltrates an organization in wartime in order to, undermine the stability of the organization. The disciples are sitting there thinking to themselves, I don't trust this. This guy is obviously just lying that he's now a follower of Jesus Christ. He's trying to get into our organization and destroy us from within. You can't blame them if that's what they were thinking. I asked you at the beginning to pay attention to the variety of risks or uncertainties that are happening in this story. And we just talked about one of them. There's an obvious sense of uncertainty with the disciples when it comes to this threat in their midst. It's an obvious risk they would be taking to take him at his word, to believe him and say, sure, Jesus said something about loving your enemies. Jesus talked about lives being transformed, so okay, you're one of us now. There's risk and uncertainty that the disciples are experiencing. The story, if you remember, and we'll get to this in a moment, has Barnabas. Barnabas says, well, I can vouch for this guy. Barnabas is putting his reputation on the line. That's a risk he's taking. We have the believers, just the general rank and file, who are hearing about what went on at the last council meeting. You know how it is when the church council makes a decision you don't really feel comfortable with. You got to have an opinion, don't you? What is this? What are they naively allowing with this decision? There's uncertainty with the believers. I want us to pause and realize that Saul is facing some uncertainty. I know none of you can imagine this, but imagine you've been part of the murder of someone, and you show up at the front door of their family and go, I'm a changed person now. Can we be friends? That's risky behavior. You're most likely going to be rejected. But then to name the other risk that's going on, God's risk. God's taking a risk, putting into this person's life, Saul, such a pathway forward for this new church. But this is a God who lives with an uncertainty, and this is a God of risk. I read an article this past week in the Harvard Business Review. And here's the article in a nutshell. Arguing that when we do strategic planning, we've been trained to think in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term horizons. What are we going to do this week? What are we going to do for this year? What's our 5-year plan? And of course, that was working tickety-boo in the world until the world went into fast forward. That was working fine and dandy until someone said, hey, let's have COVID. And everyone said, that's not in our 5-year strategic plan. We realized that time horizons are very unpredictable. And so the article is saying, instead of doing planning according to just time horizons, do planning according to risk horizons. And the article goes on to describe what that is, blah, blah, blah. But basically, the argument is risk horizons, and that approach to doing planning, ask us to focus less on predicting the future. Who can predict that COVID was going to happen? Not predicting the future, and more on reducing uncertainty through action, through doing things. Specifically, doing some experiments. Let's flesh that out a little bit. Barnabas takes a risk. Barnabas says, I'm going to vouch for Saul. And that will allow us to measure some uncertainty. And Barnabas is thinking to himself, yeah, even though I'm vouching for Saul, I'm sure there's some uncertainty here. Whether it's, will Saul behave well? Will he last? Or will people accept him? And Barnabas is basically saying, well, let's do a little experiment. I'll vouch for him, and we'll send him off into like some safe little area. We'll see how he behaves, and you can all watch, and then we'll get a clearer sense of whether we can move forward as a church with this person as a resource, as part of our the gifts that God has given us. An experiment. I want to talk about an experiment this morning. We've been talking over a number of weeks about what it means to be formed into the church, to be formed in ways that we can carry out the mission. We've done a bunch of sermons looking at a bunch of these dimensions. Andy, the sermons that you were reading that I wrote had this dimension in it. And the idea is, if we are to be balanced followers of Jesus Christ, we have to do these 5 things. And they all have something to do with a particular behavior. Talking about God. Talking about our faith. We're in worship right now. You can't do worship without talking about God. No, I won't get onto that sidetrack. You can't provide care to fellow believers to remind them of God's presence without somehow reminding them about God experiences. You can't do outreach in the world without putting gospel into nonverbal terms, but reminding yourself, why am I doing this? I'm motivated to do this because God has given me gifts. You can't learn about God without talking about God. My point is, this is a fundamental skill that we all need to have as followers of Jesus Christ. But doing so is not comfortable for us. When I say, my guess is every time I come around in a sermon, like 3 seconds ago saying, we got to build our capacity to talk about God, your blood pressure is going up to some degree. You're thinking, I'm uncertain about that. Please don't make me do that. I don't want to be engaged in that risk. as good United Church people, I'm in this also. As good United Church people, we are really uncertain about talking about our faith, not only publicly, but even privately within church circles. It's a skill we're still developing. And so, reading the Harvard Business Review, instead of thinking about developing this skill by planning what are we going to do this week and next week, how to do an experiment. To experiment with how easy can it be? How readily willing might people in this congregation be to do a really simple thing, to talk about their faith? And to be able to say to ourselves, I know we're uncertain about talking God language, but let's do an experiment around that. That's the thing we're uncertain of? Great! Let's plan an experiment around it. Now that brings us back to what we do every week before the offering comes forward. What we did before the sermon. I say to you, call to mind a blessing that you have. I'm going to ask you right now to remember, what was that blessing? And here's for some of you, the painful experiment we're going to do during the sermon right now. I'll name it for you. It might feel painful. But I'm going to say, would you be willing to take a next step here, downstairs in the Golden Jubilee room, remember what it was that was the blessing, and just turn to the person beside you and tell them the thing you were thinking about. Nothing more than that. Just tell the person beside you what was that blessing, and take turns. And for the people who don't want to participate, you don't have to. You can make something up, or you can say pass. But I'm gonna run the clock in my head, and there's like an average of 2.5 people at every table. So I'm gonna count to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And I invite you now to tell the person beside you what the blessing was that you called to mind. On your mark, get set, go. Switch if you haven't already. More seconds. Oh, you survived. I know. It feels, set aside talking about God for introverts. Simply being asked to talk out loud in a crowd is like asking you to invite Saul, persecutor, into the church. But I heard people talking, and I think that it is easy to do. And so what I'm proposing is that, where Helen is here right now, Helen has agreed to organize and run for 3 or 4 weeks for 5 or 6 of you who love being part of new experimental things, an experimental group. I don't know when it's going to meet, I don't know who's going to be involved, that'll depend on who runs up to Helen after the service, or contacts her after the service and says, you know what, I'd like to be part of this experimental group where for 3 or 4 weeks I get together with a small group of people and we answer one simple question. What's a blessing that I had this past week? When Brad invited us during the offering to recall a blessing, what did I say in my head? This is what I said. And to do that in a small group and then see where the conversation goes and where the Spirit wants to take it. So Helen, thank you for doing so. And I'm going to trust that a small group of you will approach her and say, yeah, I want to do this, and see where it goes, not only with me, but where it goes, how valuable is something like this as a way of practicing the skill in doing small groups in our church. Where would that conversation go if it became something that was done regularly in a small group? And if we do that, become comfortable talking about God, talking about our faith, well, then we start to grow in terms of the path that we're on for developing our faith on the way. Here's how the story ended, and then we'll wrap it up. After all of that worrisome stuff with Saul, the passage ends this way. Meanwhile, the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and was built up. That uncertainty called Saul, that was making everyone nervous, they didn't experiment around it, and the uncertainty went away. And when uncertainty goes away, the peace was built up. Living in the fear of the Lord instead of the fear of the uncertain, and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it increased in numbers. Amen.